Welcome to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host. Today, Bishop Barron is not with us in studio, so instead we're sharing with you his talk from the 2018 Los Angeles Religious Education Congress. This talk was titled Catholicism and Beauty and surveyed much of the beautiful and literary artistic tradition of the Catholic Church up and down the centuries. He covers everything from the poetry of Dante to the beauty of the medieval Gothic cathedrals to modern writers like Paul Claudel. And he highlights how beauty has served as an effective route of access to God. So this episode, we're going to play the first half of his talk titled Catholicism and Beauty, and next week we'll cover the second half. So sit back and enjoy the talk.
As always, a joy to be here at Congress. I remember it was many years ago I gave the keynote in this room, and it's just one of the great places, I think, in the Catholic Church today. This place and this gathering. I'll tell you a little story. I was in Washington last week for the USCCB meetings, because now I'm chair of this committee on evangelization. So I was there all week in D.C. And so I was telling someone about my itinerary coming up. I said, well, I'm here until Thursday, and then I'm going to Congress. And they said, oh, are you going to say something on the Hill? Are you visiting? I said, not that Congress. No, I'm going to the L.A. Congress. It's my 21st year. I've been coming here since 1997, pretty much every year. And it's always been, thank you. Thanks. And a special joy now to be auxiliary bishop of this great church of Los Angeles. So just a thrill to be with you all. I know everyone's been talking about St. Patrick today on his feast day, but when I was doing my prayers this morning, what was striking me was, how much I owe to the faith of my parents, passed on Catholicism to me, and of course they received it from their parents. My mother's father was carried to this country in an immigrant boat in the arms of his sister. He was a year old and was carried from Dublin at the end of the 19th century. My father's grandfather came over from County Waterford sometime the end of the 19th century, made his way eventually to Chicago. But then trace it back over the generations, back and back and back across the centuries, eventually to this great evangelizer, St. Patrick. And I'm thinking my own work as a priest and a bishop in evangelization, can be traced right back to this great heroic figure that we celebrate today. So I think it's wonderful this feast day lands right in the middle of Congress. So prayers to and an invocation of St. Patrick today. I've got some pictures for you today. They'll be appearing up here on the screen. I remember vividly, I was in third grade, and the teacher said, you're big boys and girls now, and so the books we're going to read just have words, they don't have pictures. And I remember deeply regretting that. I mean that. And I still do. I still regret the fact that books don't have pictures. In a talk on beauty, you got to show pictures, and that's really part of the great Catholic imagination, that it's more than words, as important as words are. And my life's been largely dedicated to words, studying and teaching and preaching and so on. But pictures, the beautiful, plays a key role in evangelization. Oh, and here's the last thing. I don't know if anyone noticed this, but I got back to my room after a very early breakfast. I'm up on the 12th floor of the Hilton next door. Big window. And I sat down to pray, and there was really one of the most magnificent displays of a sunrise I've ever seen. Do you ever notice that? It was like I was looking sort of southeast toward the Christ Cathedral. And there were these banks of clouds, which are unusual out here. Usually it's just blue sky. But these banks of clouds, and the sun was rising, and then it was these shafts of light coming through them. And it was like Cecil B. DeMille. So I thought, it's kind of a good omen for this talk on beauty in the Catholic tradition, and especially beauty in evangelization. Let's see if I can work on my pictures here now. I'm never good at these tech things. Let's see. Hey, there we go. I'm beginning with this figure who is probably not a household name, even among Catholics. That's appropriately enough an icon of St. John of Damascus, or John Damascene, he's called sometimes. He dies in the year 749, so he's a figure from the 8th century, born in the late 7th century. He died in that monastery of Barsabbas outside of Jerusalem. John of Damascus was a very well-educated man, moved in the high sort of cultural circles of his time. He's most famous for his victory in the iconoclast controversy. So you know what I'm talking about there. During this period, there were iconoclasts about. These were smashers of icons. Those who said, and again, to give them their due, this is not an unreasonable position. They're relying upon the Old Testament texts that say we should have no graven images of God. By the way, too, right at that time and in that part of the world, he's a Syrian monk, Islam is beginning to emerge. And of course, Islam has that very strong sense of the transcendence of God and of the inappropriateness of ever using iconography, which is true to the present day in Islam. So all of this was in the air at the time. So the smashers of icons said we should not have sacred pictures. We should not have representations of God or Christ or the saints. Well, John of Damascus, this man, rose up. Did he disappear from the screen? Where did he go? That's not John of Damascus. Me, there he is. You don't want me up there. Don't look at me. Look, there he is. John of Damascus rises up, and he defends icons. Now, what's his argument? He knew the counter-arguments very well. His argument was very simple but very powerful. St. Paul refers to Jesus as the icon of the invisible God. Is God invisible? Yes, in his own nature. Of course he is. Is God beyond all differentiation, beyond all specification? Yes, indeed. However, God himself has made an icon, a picture, an image in the humanity of Jesus. Well, if it's good enough for God, John of Damascus said, it should be good enough for us. And so he said, our icons, our beautiful depictions of God and of Christ and of the saints, of the Blessed Mother, are participations in the primordial iconography of God himself. Okay, and you say, well, that's a little interesting bit of intellectual history. Oh, but think again. Without John of Damascus, no medieval cathedrals. Without John of Damascus, no Sainte-Chapelle. Without John of Damascus, no Michelangelo, no Sistine Chapel ceiling. No tradition of the use of the arts and of beauty to propagate the gospel. And so he is really one of the most pivotal figures in the great tradition. So I wanted very much to start with him. You know, there's a direct line from John of Damascus to an old Woody Allen movie called Hannah and Her Sisters. Remember that one? From the 80s, I think it was. Well, in that movie, Woody Allen is playing typically a neurotic figure trying to figure things out. And he's on a religious quest. Well, at one point he comes to the Catholic Church and he sits down with the priest, and the priest says, well, how come you're interested in Catholicism? And Woody Allen's character said, well, first of all, it's such a beautiful religion. Well, there's a direct line from John of Damascus to that insight that, yes, indeed, we are a beautiful religion, and we've used the beautiful to propagate the faith. I don't know if you know the name Malcolm Miller. I should have found a picture of him. Where did John of Damascus go? I'm back up there again. There he goes. Okay, good. Malcolm Miller, for many, many decades, I think he's still alive, but many decades, gave tours at Chartres Cathedral in France, the greatest of the cathedrals. And I was privileged many times when I was a student there to take his tour. Well, one time he said this in a lecture. I get the fact that the church always needs to reform itself, right? Ecclesia semper reformanda. The church must always be reformed is a great Catholic principle. But Malcolm Miller said, Malcolm Miller, who loved Chartres Cathedral with all his heart, he said, but when we start destroying beautiful things, you know that a legitimate reform has now become a corruption. Dead right, it seems to me. That's the sign things have gone bad. If we start smashing the icons, John of Damascus was against it in the 8th century, we should still be against it today. Because as Catholics, we like books with pictures in them. You know, we like evangelization that speaks, but also that shows. Okay, let me show you another image here. I don't know if you remember this fellow. He's kind of a hero of mine. That's Jean-Marie Lustiger, who was the Archbishop of Paris during the 80s and 90s of the last century. I had the privilege when I was a doctoral student in Paris to hear him preach almost every Sunday. He would preach at 6:30 evening Mass at Notre Dame Cathedral on Sundays. In the typically French style, by the way, he'd preach for 20 minutes was a short sermon, usually 25 or 30 minutes. If you gave a 10-minute homily in France, they think you were sick or you hadn't prepared that week, right? But he would give these marvelous homilies in beautiful French, but also drawing typically upon the tradition of Israel. Now that's pretty natural because, as you probably remember, Jean-Marie Lustiger was a Jew, born and raised a Jew, and then at the terrible time of the Nazi period and the Shoah, his mother died in the Shoah, but he was sent to live with a Christian family for his own protection. But while he was there, he began to read the New Testament, so his mind was starting to be filled with the Christian ideas. But the decisive moment came when young Jean-Marie Lustiger, about the age of 13, walked into one of the great cathedrals. It was not so much argumentation or doctrine or words that did it, though they played a role, and though he was a great man of words, don't get me wrong. But it was the beauty of the cathedral that worked some alchemy in him that led him to say, I believe. It was the cathedral that converted him. This next figure, you probably don't know, and he's, not a household name, but one of the great Catholic artists of the last century. That's Paul Claudel. Paul Claudel died in the year, I think it was 1955. So he's born late 19th century and lives toward the middle of the 20th century. Claudel was a diplomat. He was a man of affairs, but also a magnificent poet and playwright. As a young kid, he was a non-believer. So like many of the young kids today, the so-called nuns, right, who've drifted into non-belief, he was like that as a young man. And then one day, he wandered into Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And they marked the spot, the very spot he was standing, when he was listening to evening vespers being sung. And he was looking up at that. For my money, the most magnificent of the rose windows. That's the north rose window at Notre Dame. Hearing the vespers being sung, seeing that image, the non-believing Paul Claudel came to faith. Not arguments, not doctrines, though he too became a magnificent man of words. But it was the beauty of Notre Dame that moved him to faith. I'm going to keep that image up there for a bit, and not that I'm drawing any connection between myself and the great Lustiger and Paul Claudel, but let me go back to June the 12th, 1989. It's a date I remember very vividly. It was my first day in France, so I was going over to the Institut Catholique in Paris for my doctoral studies, and I left Chicago. And whenever I hear talk about, the initiation rituals and, kind of coming of age experiences, that's what comes to my mind was that day when I left behind my family and my friends and my country and my language and ventured out into this new world. Well, I landed in Paris that day, June 12th. I had in my wallet the address of the house where I was going. It was the Redemptorist house on Montparnasse. This is pre-cell phone, of course, pre-GPS. All I had was a piece of paper. Remember that? And you write with a pen on it? That's what I had in my pocket. And I got to the place. I dropped off my bags. I was jet-lagged. I was tired. I was anxious. I was starting this great adventure. But I wandered immediately down to Notre Dame. I knew roughly where it was. I'd never been to Paris before, but I knew roughly where it was. Wandered down there. I walked up the nave. I came to the transept, and I stood pretty much exactly where Paul Claudel stood. And I looked up at that window. Now, I was a priest at the time. I wasn't a non-believer. I fully believe the Christian faith. But there was something about that window that was so powerful. So I stood that day for probably 20 minutes looking at it. And I'm not kidding when I say this. I came back every single day. That was June 12th until I went home for Christmas. So sometime in mid-December. I came back every single day. And I stood roughly from where that picture was taken and stared at that window. Now, what was happening? I still can't entirely explain it. Obviously not words or doctrine or teaching. But that window was working in me, I think, something very similar to what it worked in Jean-Marie Lustiger, what it worked in Paul Claudel. It was working some alchemy of the soul that was drawing things together, convincing me at the level of the heart. And I think now, if I go back over books I've written and so on, and speeches I've given over the years, how often the symbolism of that window plays a role. Beauty can grab us sometimes in a way that's beyond what words can communicate. So we'll move from Lustiger and Paul Claudel and Notre Dame to Pope Francis. Because Pope Francis, I think, one of his many gifts is the gift of the beautiful gesture, right? Now, he is a man of words. God knows, as all these people are. But the particular genius of Pope Francis, I think, is the beautiful gesture. The washing of the feet, the embracing of the man with the severe deformities, the paying of his bill at the priest's hostel. I mean, you know all the moves that he makes. And I don't mean that at all cynically. I think he's a great artist who uses these beautiful gestures to communicate the Christian faith. But do you remember in his encyclical, Evangelii Gaudium, and can I give a little editorial here? All the debate about Amoris Laetitia, and I get it. I love Amoris Laetitia. It's full of all kinds of wonderful things, and we've been debating about the famous chapter 8. And nothing wrong with that debate. It's an important one. But my fear is that it can block our awareness of the importance of this document, because Francis himself has on many occasions said, the key to my pontificate is Evangelii Gaudium, the great statement on evangelization. And of course, and popes typically do this, he's using that title, he's mimicking Evangelii Nunciandi of Paul VI, right? Which is the master text of the new evangelization. That's where it all started. It's the granddaddy of the new evangelization. The church doesn't have a mission, the church is a mission. All of that, which then massively influenced the pontificate of John Paul II. So that's the letter that Pope Francis sees, and I think quite correctly, as the linchpin, the key to his papacy. Now, I'm highlighting it here because in that great letter you find a stress upon the via pulchritudinis, that Latin phrase for, wait for it, the way of beauty, the way of the beautiful. He's standing right in the tradition I've been outlining. Words, yes, indeed. And again, please don't get me wrong on this. Bishop Barron, he's just for beauty, not for words. No, I just gave a talk last week at a conference at Notre Dame, and I made a great stress on a new apologetics and these intellectual issues that are bedeviling our kids. So don't get me wrong. However, I agree with Pope Francis here that the via pulchritudinis, from John of Damascus on, has been and should continue to be a great means of evangelization. Okay, that's my introduction, but now don't get worried. The speech won't be that long. That's 20-minute introduction. Wow. Don't worry, it won't be that long. Well, I know what you're tempted to say. The beautiful. Okay, I get it, I guess, the beautiful. But look, isn't beauty kind of subjective, ephemeral? Beauty's in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? I mean, what's beautiful for you is not beautiful for me. So, how can the beautiful really be a route of evangelization or proclamation of the Christian thing? Well, let me draw your attention now to this fellow. Hans Urs von Balthasar, one of the great theologians of the 20th century. Balthasar, in his work, I'll put my philosopher's hat on for a second here, he reversed the Kantian transcendentals. So Immanuel Kant gives us the critique of pure reason, then the critique of practical reason, and then the critique of judgment. He looked at the true, then the good, then the beautiful, right? Balthasar reversed it in his work. So he gave us first what's called the glory of the Lord. It's a 7-volume study of beauty in the Christian tradition. He then gave us the theodrama, which is an exploration of the good. And then finally he gave us the theologic, the true. Now, the Balthasar insight, that beautiful is not some little ephemeral thing off on the side. The beautiful as one of the 3 great transcendentals. That means wherever you find being, you're going to find the good, the true, and the beautiful. And, now listen, and today especially, the beautiful might be the best route of access. I think Balthasar intuited this. Now, how come? Well, think of our postmodern time that we're in. You talk about the truth, right? I got the truth for you. What's the typical reaction in our culture when you say, I got the truth for you, and you better believe it? Right? The hackles go up. Even more so when you say, I've got the good. I've got the life you ought to be living. Why aren't you living it? Right? That's when the hackles go up even more dramatically. In our relativistic postmodern time, truth and goodness can be awkward starting points. But, and I think Balthasar got this, the beautiful is less threatening. It's more winsome, isn't it? I'm not telling you what to think or how to act. I'm just saying, look. Look. Think of Paul Claudel, or me on June 12th, 1989, looking at the rose window. It wasn't dictating terms to me. It wasn't telling me what to think or how to behave. But look at it. Just look at it. And its beauty will work some kind of alchemy in you. I think Balthasar got that. That beginning with the beauty of Christ will lead you to the imitation of Christ, which will finally lead you to understanding Christ from the inside. Does that make sense? Start with the glory of the form. Look at him. Look at the icon of the invisible God. And then you'll be drawn into that life. You'll want to live it. And then having lived it, you'll understand it. See what I mean? The rhythm from the beautiful to the good to the true. Can I suggest, everybody, I think we tend to get that backwards. And that causes trouble evangelically. I'm going to go from Balthasar to Denny McClain. Now, anyone here remember Denny McClain? Is there anybody? Any Detroiters here by any chance? All right, good. A handful of you remember poor Denny McClain, the last man to win 30 games in a Major League Baseball season. Well, when I was a kid, Denny McClain was my hero. I grew up, I spent 5 years as a little kid outside Detroit. And it would have been 1967, my dad brought my brother and me to a Tigers game in the old Tigers Stadium. So I'm 7 years old. You now know how old I am. I was 7 years old, and though it happened a long time ago, it is vividly in my memory. Coming up with my dad and my brother out of the bowels of Tiger Stadium, it was a night game, and seeing that bright green field, and Denny's got the home uniform on there, so the gleaming white of the Tigers uniforms. And there I watched, on that beautiful field and these beautiful uniforms, watched the players play. And anybody that's sensitive to sports knows that the joy of watching sports, and the Greeks understood this, was the beauty of it, right? I mean, watching amateurs play is not all that thrilling, but when you watch the professionals play, you really know how to do it. It's the beauty of the play. Wait, I'm 7 years old, but I'm as struck by that scene as I was years later by the North Rose window. The beauty of the game. I got one more Tiger up there. Yeah, there's the great Al Kaline. And again, Detroiters, remember him? Yeah, all four of you remember the Al Kaline. The greatest Detroit Tiger, probably. Got 3,007 hits in his career. 399 home runs, I think. Anyway, there's L. Kaline. He's in the away uniform, so not quite as brilliant as the home uniform. But I watched the Tigers play that night in that stadium. The beauty and radiance and splendor of the game showed itself to me. Now, what did it lead to? Almost immediately, a desire to play. So it was that year that I joined Little League. I played T-ball. We still have T-ball, by the way, for little kids. So I love T-ball, and it got me into baseball because having seen the beauty of it, I wanted to play. Then I played baseball from the time I was 7 until I was probably about 16 or so in high school. Having played, I came to understand the game from the inside, right? The rules and regulations and disciplines of baseball became natural to me. They were not imposed as some terrible burden from the outside. But playing the game, I came organically to understand the reason for the rules and disciplines of the game. In other words, I followed, long before I knew who Hans Urs von Balthasar was, I followed the Balthasar rhythm from the beautiful, look at that, to the play, the good, I want to play, and finally to the true. Understanding, yes, even arcane rules such as the infield fly rule, right? Baseball fans know what I'm talking about. 2 runners on base. If there's a pop-up in the infield, the batter's automatically out because the infielder could catch the ball, drop it on purpose, and force a triple or double play, right? Now, I like the infield fly rule. That's a cool rule. And once you played baseball, you say, yeah, that makes sense. I like that. Okay, you're teaching baseball to a kid. What don't you do? You're a bunch of 7-year-olds. All right, listen, boys, let's begin with the infield fly rule. Right? Come on. I mean, we'll get there, and I love it. Don't get me wrong. I love the infield fly rule. Little picky rule. No, it's not a little picky rule. It helps the integrity of the game. See, I think one of the problems we have, let's talk for another day, is in the teaching of our faith, we often begin with the infield fly rule. No, begin with the splendor and the glory of the game. You bring those kids onto the field. I had coaches when I was a little guy, good coaches who got us down on our hands and knees to touch the infield. And that's a good move because if you're an infielder and you need to field the ball, you can't be afraid of getting dirty. You can't be afraid of falling down. You got to get comfortable in that space. The smells and rhythms and beauty of the game, that's what you start with. So I think for us Catholics, begin with the splendor of Catholicism, the splendor of the game, the splendor of the life. Draw people then to the good and finally to the true.
We hope you enjoyed the first half of this talk on Catholicism and beauty, and we encourage you to tune in next week to the Word on Fire show to hear the rest of the talk. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.